On June 4th, Netflix releases two documentaries revisiting a murder that reshaped British policing. It began on a summer morning in 1992, when a young mother was killed during a walk on Wimbledon Common. Rachel Nickell had been stabbed 49 times. Her 2-year-old son, Alex, was found at the scene, clinging to her body and pleading for her to wake up. The brutality of the attack, witnessed by a toddler, left a permanent mark on the public consciousness. Investigators worked under heavy public scrutiny to find a killer, but they found no physical evidence at the scene. There were no fingerprints, no usable DNA, and no weapon. Without a forensic trail to follow, the Metropolitan Police faced a complete investigative stall. This absence of traditional leads pushed the department toward a highly unconventional and unscientific strategy. The police consulted Paul Britton, a criminal profiler. Britton developed a theoretical portrait of the killer, describing a man driven by specific sexual fantasies and social isolation. This profile, however, lacked any established scientific foundation. Detectives soon focused on Colin Stagg, a local man who frequently walked his dog on the common. Despite a lack of proof, the investigation team became convinced Stagg was the individual described in Britton's profile. To bridge the gap between their hunch and a conviction, the police decided to intervene directly. They designed a scenario intended to draw out a confession by matching the suspect's behavior to the profiler's predictions. The objective shifted. Detectives were no longer evaluating evidence from a crime scene. They were working to validate a psychological theory they had already accepted as fact. This diagram shows the mechanics of the operation: a profiler and an undercover officer working to influence a suspect. An officer using the pseudonym Lizzie James was deployed to befriend Stagg and pull him into a fabricated relationship. For months, Lizzie James followed Britton's instructions, introducing themes of violent sexual fantasies into their letters and meetings. The goal was to see if Stagg would mirror these ideas, proving he was the killer. As the diagram illustrates, the primary objective failed. Stagg engaged in the conversations, but never confessed. He maintained his innocence throughout the undercover operation. Even without a confession, the police moved forward. Stagg was arrested in 1993 and held at Wandsworth Prison for 13 months, based entirely on the records of the undercover operation. While he waited for trial, the media treated his guilt as a settled matter. Tabloid coverage ensured his face was synonymous with the murder, effectively ending his private life before a judge ever heard the case. In 1994, the case reached the Old Bailey, where Mr. Justice Ognall famously stopped the trial. He described the honey trap as deceptive conduct of the grossest kind and ruled the evidence inadmissible. Colin Stagg was acquitted. The investigation was a product of institutional confirmation bias. By fixating on a psychological profile over physical facts, the state spent years pursuing an innocent man. While the Metropolitan Police were focused exclusively on Stagg, the actual killer remained active. Robert Napier, a man with a history of severe mental illness, was living in southeast London entirely unmonitored. In November 1993, while Stagg sat in a prison cell, Napier murdered Samantha Bissett and her 4-year-old daughter, Jasmine. The crimes shared chilling similarities with the attack on Wimbledon Common. The police's refusal to look past their initial suspect provided Napier with the anonymity he needed to strike again. Their focus on the wrong man came with a lethal price. Forensic advances finally identified Robert Napper in 2008. He pleaded guilty to the manslaughter of Rachel Nickell. Since he was already being held at Broadmoor Hospital for the Bissett murders, he was simply returned to the high-security psychiatric ward. Colin Stagg eventually received £706,000 in compensation for his wrongful imprisonment. However, the financial settlement did not erase his public association with the crime. His name remains permanently linked to the case in every digital record. Alex Hanscom, the toddler who found his mother on the common, grew up in France to escape the media circus. Now 34, he has published his own account of the tragedy and works as an advocate for other victims of violence. The final accounting of the case is a study in irony. The victim and the falsely accused had their lives irrevocably altered, while the killer remained in the same facility where he had lived for the previous decade. Despite the scathing judicial criticism, the officers who authorized the honey trap faced no criminal charges or internal disciplinary action. Paul Britton faced an inquiry by the British Psychological Society. The board found his actions fell short of required standards, yet he was allowed to keep his license and continue his career. The investigation into Rachel Nickell's murder serves as a warning. It shows how easily a system can manufacture a villain.
Okay, let's jump right into this explainer. With Netflix dropping highly anticipated titles like The Witness and The Murder of Rachel Nickell on June 4th, a lot of us are about to revisit one of the absolute most infamous crimes in British history. Now, those shows are going to cover the murder itself, the wrongful accusation, and the eventual conviction. But today, we are doing something a bit different. We're focusing strictly on the AfterFall. We're looking at the devastating aftermath, the completely destroyed lives, and the frankly shocking institutional failures that almost nobody was ever held accountable for. To really understand the catastrophic scale of this systemic failure, you just have to trace how the events actually unfolded. We're talking about a horrific murder in 1992, an innocent man's life being ripped apart in 1993, the real killer claiming even more lives in 1994, while the police literally looked the other way, and the actual truth not legally coming to light until 2008. It's just an unbelievable chain of events. Section 1. The Wimbledon Common Tragedy. A morning that changed British public consciousness. It was July 15, 1992. 23-year-old model and mother Rachel Nickell took her 2-year-old son Alex for a routine morning walk on Wimbledon Common. But she didn't come home. A walker later found Rachel's body on the Common. She had been brutally killed, stabbed 49 times, her throat cut, and sexually assaulted. But the detail that permanently etched this crime into the minds of an entire generation was that her toddler, he, was found clinging to her body in a public park, covered in her blood, just pleading with her to wake up. Section 2. Framing an innocent man. The destruction of Colin Stagg. So the police zeroed in on Colin Stagg, a 26-year-old local guy who perfectly matched a psychological profile drawn up by an expert. There was just one really massive problem. They had absolutely zero physical evidence linking him to the scene. Nothing. So what did they do? The Metropolitan Police commissioned a honey trap operation. They used an undercover female officer, going by the fake name Lizzie James, to befriend Stagg. For months, she faked a romantic relationship with him, actively pushing him to reveal violent sexual fantasies that would fit their shiny new profile. But despite her relentless, constant pressure, Stagg never confessed. He repeatedly and explicitly denied killing Rachel. 13. That is the horrific cost of the investigators' tunnel vision. Based almost entirely on manipulated conversations from that shady honey trap operation, Colin Stagg spent 13 agonizing months locked up on remand in Wandsworth Prison for a murder he simply did not commit. When the case finally went to trial in September 1994, the judge, Mr. Justice Ognall, completely threw out the honey trap evidence. His exact words, "deceptive conduct of the grossest kind." The judge basically said the whole operation was designed to incriminate Stagg, not to actually find the truth. So Colin Stagg walked free out of the Old Bailey. But you have to remember, the intense media circus had already treated him as a guilty monster for well over a year. He was technically free, but his life and his reputation, they were in absolute ruins. Section 3. The real killer's freedom. The tragic cost of tunnel vision. Now, here is where things go from bad to completely devastating. While the police were pouring all of their time, money, and resources into destroying Colin Stagg, a paranoid schizophrenic named Robert Napper was still out there, and he had a history of reported sexual offenses that were just ignored, inadequately investigated. And then the unthinkable happened. In November 1993, literally while Colin Stagg was sitting in a prison cell awaiting trial, Napper walked into a flat in Plumstead. He murdered 28-year-old Samantha Bissett and her 4-year-old daughter Jasmine, and these murders bore striking physical similarities to Rachel Nickell's killing. Napper was finally caught for the Bissett murders in 1994 and sent to Broadmoor Hospital indefinitely. 16. It took 16 long, painful years after Rachel Nickell's death before advances in DNA finally gave investigators the definitive forensic links tying Robert Napper to that crime scene on Wimbledon Common. 16 years of a completely unresolved nightmare. Which brings us to a really hollow conclusion. In December 2008, Robert Napper pleaded guilty to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. There was no dramatic cathartic trial. 16 years after a young mother was killed right in front of her child, the man actually responsible simply entered a plea and was shipped right back to the exact same high-security psychiatric facility where he'd already been living for over a decade. Section 4.
the son left behind, the boy on the common today.
Shortly after the murder, Alex's father, Andre, made the incredibly tough but deliberate choice to move them to France. He wanted to escape the suffocating grip of the British tabloids and get his son as far away as possible from a trauma that no child should ever have to carry. Fast forward to 2026, Alex Hanscom is now 34 years old. It really puts the passage of time into perspective, doesn't it? And he actually provides the central perspective for the new Netflix drama series, The Witness. He's the 2-year-old who saw the unthinkable, now a grown man carrying that unimaginable knowledge. But Alex's resilience? It is genuinely remarkable. Growing up in France, he had to gradually learn the horrific truth of his mother's death in pieces. In 2012, he published his book, The Boy on the Common. He was even there in the courtroom for Napper's 2008 guilty plea. And today, he's transformed his own profound childhood trauma into lifelong advocacy for other victims' families. He somehow took the darkest moment imaginable and forged a real path forward.
Section 5. The absence of accountability. Who paid the price?
You see, Colin Stagg's acquittal in 1994 didn't just magically fix his life. His reputation was publicly obliterated. He got hate mail, he couldn't hold down a job, and he struggled to form relationships. It wasn't until 2008, 13 years after he was cleared, and only after Napper's official guilty plea, that the Home Office awarded Stagg £706,000 in compensation. He got a formal apology, sure, but money doesn't buy back over a decade of public vilification. Even right now, if you search his name, there's a permanent internet association with a brutal murder he had absolutely nothing to do with.
It all boils down to this totally infuriating comparison. On one side, you have the destroyed lives. Colin Stagg, ruined. Samantha and Jasmine beset, murdered because the actual killer was ignored. Alex, traumatized for life. And on the other side, the consequences for the authorities who orchestrated a universally condemned honey trap. The senior officers involved, they faced absolutely zero meaningful disciplinary action or criminal charges. They just retired and collected their pensions. And Paul Britton, the profiler who designed the whole psychological trap, he faced an inquiry, but he got to keep his practice. So I want to end this explainer by leaving you with a question to really chew on. Does a guilty plea from a man who's already been locked in a psychiatric facility for over a decade truly count as justice? When you tune in to watch the dramatizations of this crime, I just hope you remember that this is the true devastating aftermath. A killer ignored, an innocent life derailed, and massive institutions entirely shielding themselves from the very real damage they caused. Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the full story.